There is a scene in Season 10 of Family Guy where Meg Griffin, after years of absorbing everything the household throws at her, finally snaps and tells her family exactly what they are. She is precise. She is accurate. Every word lands. The family falls apart without her as the target. And then she apologizes and goes back to being the punching bag, and the show moves on like none of it happened. That scene is the most honest 40 seconds Family Guy ever produced about itself, and almost nobody talks about what it actually means. Today, we are going to change that. We are going to go through all 22 seasons, deep dive into 14 specific episodes, and make the case that Family Guy built one of the most detailed and damaging portraits of broken parenting in the history of animated television, understood exactly what it was building, and then chose to keep building it anyway. Welcome to Red Umbrella. If you are new here, subscribing is free, and it helps more than you know. Let us get into it. The wound that made the parent, Peter's childhood, and the cycle it created. There is a moment in the season 15 episode Peter's Sister, where Peter Griffin, a grown man with 3 kids of his own, gets beaten up by his older sister Karen in front of his entire family. Not playfully, not as a joke that resolves cleanly. Karen Griffin is a bully in the truest sense of the word, and watching her go after Peter, you start to understand something the show had been quietly building for over a decade. Peter does not hurt his children because he is stupid. He hurts his children because someone hurt him first, and nobody ever stopped it. That is the real story underneath all the slapstick and the cutaway gags. Family Guy built a father whose entire relationship with his kids can be traced back to a childhood where love and cruelty came from the same house, sometimes from the same person, and where nobody ever stepped in to make it stop. Understanding Peter Griffin as a parent means going back before the Griffin house on Spooner Street, before Quahog, before Lois and the kids. It means going back to a boy who grew up under Francis Griffin and what that did to him. Francis Griffin was Peter's stepfather. He was a deeply religious, deeply stubborn Irish-American Catholic who made no secret of the fact that he found Peter a disappointment. The show gives you Francis in pieces across multiple seasons, and none of the pieces are warm. He subjected Peter to emotional abuse, verbal abuse, and psychological abuse throughout his childhood. He never showed Peter affection. When Karen bullied Peter, Francis did not intervene. He simply let it happen, which is its own kind of message to a child. The message is, you are not worth protecting. Francis also drank. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. Peter's current drinking habits, his pattern of going to the clam with his friends and coming home inebriated, his history of being fired from jobs for showing up drunk, all of it mirrors Francis almost exactly. Peter worked at the Pawtucket Mill. Before that, he worked at the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory and was fired. Francis lost jobs because of alcohol too. The show is not being subtle about this. It is showing you a man who absorbed the patterns of his upbringing so completely that he recreated them without appearing to notice. And then there is the biological father. When Peter found out that Francis was his stepfather and not his blood relation, he traveled to Ireland to find his real dad, Mickey McFinnigan. He found him. He introduced himself. Mickey laughed at him and assumed Peter had shown up wanting money. He rejected Peter outright. So by the time Peter Griffin becomes a father himself, he has been abandoned by one father, emotionally destroyed by another, and physically bullied by a sister, while both parents watched and did nothing. That is the foundation. That is what he is working with when Meg, Chris, and Stewie arrive. What the show does with this information is genuinely interesting, and also genuinely uncomfortable. It does not excuse Peter, it explains him. Those are different things. And Family Guy is at its most honest in the early seasons when it holds that distinction carefully. Peter is not cruel because the show needs someone to be cruel. He is cruel in the specific, recognizable way of someone who has never shown a different option. He did not grow up watching a patient father figure his way through a hard moment with a child. He grew up watching a man use anger and distance as the primary parenting tools available. And those are the tools Peter picked up without realizing he was picking them up. The moment Peter's sister makes this undeniable is the conversation Peter has with Meg near the end of the episode. After Meg helps him stand up to Karen, after the physical fight is over, Peter tells Meg that he is sorry for the way he has treated her. He says, more or less, that he was taking his pain out on her, that he was stupid to do it. For one episode, the show pulls back the curtain and shows you exactly what has been happening and why. Peter was Karen's target. He could never fight back against Karen. Meg was available. Meg was smaller. Meg would not fight back. And so the thing that was done to Peter got passed along to his daughter the same way it always gets passed along, quietly, without anyone formally deciding to do it. The technical term for this is a generational cycle. The show never uses that term. It does not not need to. What it shows you is plain enough. Frances abused Peter. Peter's sister Karen treated Peter in a deeply inappropriate and harmful way. Peter absorbed that treatment for his entire childhood with no one defending him. And then Peter had children of his own, and Meg became the person the family's cruelty landed on. What makes this especially worth looking at closely is how the show handles the moments when Peter is genuinely good with his kids, because those moments exist, particularly in the early seasons. In the first few years of Family Guy, Peter was not the monster he eventually became. He was careless and immature and often selfish, but there were genuine flashes of a father who actually loved his children and wanted things to go well for them. When Chris was being bullied by a kid named Kyle in The Tan Aquatic with Steve Zissou, Peter went to talk to Kyle's parents. When Meg was being bothered by Quagmire in Meg and Quagmire, Peter noticed and put a stop to it. These moments did not disappear entirely until much later in the show's run. Those early good moments are actually part of what makes the abuse so difficult to watch, both as comedy and as something more than comedy. Because what they tell you is that Peter knows, somewhere underneath the impulsiveness and the drinking and the short attention span, how a father is supposed to behave. He has glimpses of it. He reaches for it occasionally. And then it slips, and what comes out instead is the thing Frances taught him, which is that love and contempt can live in the same house and nobody has to explain why. There is a detail the show reveals across multiple episodes about how the Griffin children came to exist at all. Meg was born because birth control pills were canceled out by cold medicine. Chris was born because of a broken condom, and the lawsuit from the manufacturer is actually what gave Peter and Lois the money to buy the house on Spooner Street. Stewie used time travel to engineer his own conception. None of the Griffin children were planned. That is the show's own established logic, not a reading you have to force onto it. Peter became a father the same way he became everything else, by accident, without preparation, carrying everything he had never dealt with from his own upbringing. And that upbringing included something else the show returns to in multiple episodes. Peter had an IQ of 70, confirmed in the season 4 episode Petarded. The show establishes this as a clinical finding. He qualifies as intellectually limited. This is not simply a joke at Peter's expense. It is actually a meaningful piece of the parenting picture, because it means Peter genuinely does not always understand the weight of what he is doing. Frances raised a boy who was emotionally beaten down, never given real tools for handling his own feelings, and who also genuinely struggles to process cause and effect the way most adults can. He became a father carrying all of that. What the show does with Frances that is particularly sharp is show you his death. Peter accidentally causes Frances to die. And in that moment, despite everything, despite the abuse and the coldness and the years of being told he was not enough, Peter is devastated. He tells Frances he loves him. Frances, in his final words, calls Peter a fat, stinking drunk. That is how it ends between them. Peter never gets a different version of his father. He never gets a moment where Frances turns around and says he was wrong. The wound stays open, and Peter goes home to his own children carrying it. The show eventually stops taking this seriously. By the later seasons, particularly after season 8, Peter's bad parenting becomes less of a portrait of a damaged man and more of a delivery system for shock. The nuance that made the early seasons genuinely interesting, the sense that Peter was a person shaped by real forces doing real damage to the people around him, gets replaced by something louder and less honest. But the foundation is there, laid down carefully in the first several seasons, and it is built on something true. Generational damage does not announce itself. It does not show up in a family wearing a sign. It looks like a father who never learned how to be patient because no one was ever patient with him. It looks like a man who drinks the same way his stepfather drank, who loses jobs the same way his stepfather lost jobs, who finds one person in his household to absorb the family's worst moments the same way Karen found him. It looks like Peter Griffin. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy even inside a comedy, is that the show establishes Peter loves his children. Not always, not consistently, not in the ways that count when it matters most, but the love is in there somewhere, buried under everything Frances left behind and everything Mickey refused to give. Peter did not choose to be the kind of father he became. He inherited it. The question the show keeps dancing around and never quite fully answers is whether inheriting something is the same as choosing it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that question points directly toward Meg, the child who absorbed what Peter inherited, the one who paid the steepest price for a wound that started before she was born. Because what happened to Meg in this family is not just about Peter being careless, serious or the show needing a punching bag. It is about something more specific, more deliberate, and considerably darker than that. Section 2. Early Peter versus Late Peter. What Flanderization reveals about the show's relationship with fatherhood. There is a version of Peter Griffin that most people who watched Family Guy in its early years remember clearly. He was big and loud and not very smart, but there was something underneath all of that which made him feel like a real person. He loved his wife in a clumsy, obvious way. He wanted his kids to be happy, even when he had no idea how to make that happen. When he made a mess of things, and he always made a mess of things, the episode usually ended with Peter understanding, at least a little, what he had done wrong. That version of Peter Griffin existed. He was the main character of one of the most watched animated shows on television, and somewhere along the way, he disappeared. What replaced him is harder to like and harder to defend. The Peter Griffin of the later seasons is not a good man who does bad things without meaning to. He is something closer to a man who does bad things because the writers needed someone to do them. The warmth dried up. The self-awareness, which was never large to begin with, shrank to almost nothing. The moments where he turned to his children with something that looked like genuine care became rarer and rarer until they started feeling like mistakes in the script rather than glimpses of who he actually was. Something changed in Peter Griffin between the early seasons of Family Guy and the later ones, and tracking exactly what changed tells you a great deal about what the show actually believed about fatherhood and what it eventually stopped believing. In the beginning, Seth MacFarlane described Peter in a way that is worth sitting with. He said Peter was like Archie Bunker without the knowledge of what he is doing. Archie Bunker, for those who do not know, was the central character of a 1970s television show called All in the Family, a bigoted, loud, working-class man whose ignorance was the subject of the comedy rather than the comedy itself. MacFarlane's version of Peter worked the same way. Peter was not the hero whose point of view the show endorsed. He was the subject of examination. His ignorance, his selfishness, his failure to understand the consequences of his own behavior. These were not things the show celebrated. They were things the show held up and said, look at this. Look at what this does. That framing matters enormously when you are trying to understand Peter as a father. Because a Peter who is examined by the show is a very different character from a Peter who is simply celebrated by it. In the early seasons, the show examined him. He would do something careless with one of his children. The episode would trace the damage, and by the end there would be some form of reckoning. Not always a dramatic one, not always a lesson that felt earned or complete, but the show's structure acknowledged that Peter's behavior had weight, that it landed on people, that it produced consequences someone had to deal with. The season 1 episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, is a small but clear example of this. Peter gets the family's television access cut off due to something he causes, and is forced to actually be present with his family. He becomes more active, more involved, and the episode treats this as a genuinely better version of him. When the television comes back, the pullback toward passivity is treated as a loss rather than a relief. The show knew in that early period that Peter's checked out quality as a father was a problem worth naming. Season 2 and 3 continue this pattern. There are episodes where Peter fails his kids in specific, recognizable ways, and the failure is the point. His relationship with Meg in the early seasons is thoughtless and often hurtful, but it carries a different quality than what came later. The cruelty has not yet become the content. Peter does not notice Meg the way he should because he is distracted and self-centered, but the show's camera, so to speak, is always watching what his inattention costs her. That watching eye is what made early Family Guy feel like it had something to say. Then came the cancellation and the revival. Family Guy was canceled by Fox in 2002 after 3 seasons. DVD sales were enormous. Fan interest stayed high. The show came back in 2005 with season 4, and something subtle but important had shifted. The writers had learned, in the years away, what the audience responded to most. The cutaway gags, the references, the outrageous moments that pushed further than other shows would go. Those things had always been part of Family Guy. Coming back, they became more and more the whole of it. Season 4 is still, by most accounts, strong television. Episodes like the Cleveland Loretta Quagmire and Petarded do real character work even while pushing the comedy into stranger territory. But season 4 is also where the seeds of what would eventually undo Peter as a character were planted. The writers discovered that the audience loved it when Peter did something shocking. The shock got a bigger response than the reflection that followed it, and so, gradually, the shock began to come without the reflection attached. Peter finding out his IQ is 70 in Petarded is genuinely interesting storytelling because the episode takes that information seriously and traces what it means for Peter's self-image image and his place in the family. But the moment that detail became established, it also became a kind of permission slip. If Peter is clinically limited, then anything he does can be written off as the product of that limitation. The show began using his low intelligence as a reason to stop holding him to any standard at all. By season 7, the shift was noticeable enough that fans were actively discussing it. By season 8, most would say it was complete. The Peter Griffin of season 8 onward is a man who abuses his daughter Meg in ways that go well beyond carelessness. He throws things at her. He excludes her deliberately. In one episode, he physically throws her food at her while she is sick in bed. These are not the actions of a man who loves his children but struggles to show it. They are the actions of a character who has been written past the point of satire and into something the show no longer knows how to frame. The term that gets used for this kind of change in an animated character is Flanderization. The word comes from a character in The Simpsons, Ned Flanders, whose defining trait of being extremely religious was exaggerated over time until it was all he was. Flanderization means taking one quality of a character and blowing it up until it swallows everything else. For Peter, the quality that got blown up was his stupidity and his selfishness. In the early seasons, those were two traits among several. By the later seasons, they were the only traits that consistently showed up. What this did to Peter as a father is significant and worth being precise about. The early Peter was a bad father in the way that a real person can be a bad father, through inattention, through carrying unresolved damage from his own childhood, through not having the tools he needed and not knowing how to get them. Those are the kinds of failures that have weight because they are recognizable. People watching those early seasons could see something true in Peter's failings, which is what made the comedy land. You laughed because the show had put its finger on something real. The later Peter is a bad father in the way a cartoon character can be a bad father, when the writers have stopped asking why. There is no psychology underneath it anymore. There is no connection to Francis, or to Karen, or to Mickey McFinnigan, or to any of the things that made Peter's behavior make sense. He is mean to his children, particularly to Meg, because that is what Peter does now, and the show has stopped interrogating it. This matters for a specific reason that is easy to miss if you are watching episodes in isolation. When a show presents a character's bad behavior within a structure that examines and questions it, the audience understands that the show is not endorsing the behavior. When a show presents the same bad behavior without any surrounding structure of consequence or reflection, the behavior starts to feel like the point rather than the problem. Early Family Guy was examining Peter's failures as a father. Later Family Guy was largely just performing them. There is a moment in the show that captures this shift in a single scene. In the episode April in Quahog, Peter tells Lois that he hates being around his kids because they do not do anything and are not entertaining to him. This line is played as a joke. In the early seasons, a version of this sentiment might have appeared, but the episode would have been built around examining what that attitude costs the children on the receiving end of it. In the later seasons, it is just something Peter says, and the camera moves on. One of the clearest signs of how complete the change was is what happens in episodes where Peter becomes a better person. When the show occasionally put Peter through an experience that made him more self-aware or more functional as a husband and father, the family consistently tried to revert him. The logic inside the show's world became, over time, that the broken version of Peter was the correct version, and any improvement was a temporary malfunction. That is a genuinely dark idea dressed up as a joke, and the show barely noticed it was making it. Seth MacFarlane stepped back from the day-to-day running of the writer's room as the show went on, turning his attention to films and other projects. The writers who took on more of the daily work did what writers in that situation often do. They pushed harder on the things that had worked before. More cutaways, more shock, more Peter doing the most extreme version of whatever he was already doing. What got lost in that process was the restraint that had made the early seasons feel like they were about something. The show that debuted in 1999 had a specific idea about Peter Griffin. He was a man shaped by his upbringing, limited by his intelligence, genuinely loving in his better moments, genuinely damaging in his worse ones, and surrounded by a family that bore the cost of both. That idea required the show to keep looking at Peter honestly, to keep asking what his behavior meant and who it hurt. The later seasons stopped asking. And when a show stops asking what a father's failures mean, it stops being a show about a family and becomes something harder to name. The version of Peter that ended up in front of viewers for the show's longest stretch was not the one MacFarlane originally built. It was a louder, crueler, simpler thing, wearing the same name and the same voice. The early Peter was a bad father because the show understood why. The late Peter was a bad father because the writers needed him to be one, and it stopped needing to understand anything beyond that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the the channel tremendously. What all of this built, across seasons and across the specific bodies of the children who grew up in that house, was a family with one child who absorbed the very worst of it. One child who the show decided, early and deliberately, would be the target. And the story of that decision, and what it cost the character on the receiving end of it, is one of the most revealing things Family Guy ever put on screen. Section 3. Meg Griffin. What happens when the show makes a child into a punchline? Meg Griffin did not start out as the family's punching bag. That is the part most people forget, or never knew in the first place, because by the time most viewers came to Family Guy, the pattern of treating Meg as the person everyone's cruelty landed on was already so established that it felt like it had always been that way. It had not. There was a version of Meg Griffin that existed before the show decided what she was going to be. And the distance between that version and what she eventually became tells you something important about how the show's relationship with parenting went wrong. In the pilot episode, Meg was written as a recognizable teenager, awkward, a little dramatic, trying to figure out who she was in the way that 15-year-olds do. She was not the most original character on the show, but she was a person. She had a point of view. She had feelings the show treated as worth something. She was voiced in that first season by Lacey Chabert, who left after the season ended because of scheduling conflicts with her work on Party of Five. Mila Kunis took over the role from season 2 onward, and Seth MacFarlane told Kunis that Meg was essentially the family's equivalent of Cousin John from The Munsters, the one who was considered strange and out of place among everyone else. That framing is telling. By the time Kunis stepped in, the creative decision about who Meg was going to be had already been made. She was going to be the odd one out, the one nobody wanted around. What the show did from that point forward was systematic in a way that is uncomfortable to look at directly. The writers made a deliberate choice to use Meg as the target for whatever the family needed to put somewhere. When Peter needed to be awful to someone, it was Meg. When the show needed a character to fail publicly, it was Meg. When an episode required someone to be rejected, humiliated, or ignored, Meg was available. This was not an accident of bad writing. It was a conscious creative direction, confirmed by MacFarlane's own comparison of her to the Munsters character. The show built a child and then decided her primary function was to absorb damage. Meg is the oldest child of Peter and Lois Griffin. She attends James Woods Regional High School in Quahog, Rhode Island. The show establishes early that she was born because Lois's birth control pills were canceled out by cold medicine, meaning she was not planned. Her full legal name, as revealed in the episode A Fistful of Meg, is Megatron, because Peter got hold of her birth certificate after she was born and changed her name as a reference to the Transformers character, without telling anyone. Her mother had already chosen Megan. Peter changed it anyway, and the show treats this as a throwaway gag. It is also the first act of erasure the show commits against Meg, happening before she could walk or talk. What the show documented about Meg's daily life across its run is genuinely difficult to read as comedy once you stop and write it down plainly. Her father physically threw food at her while she was sick in bed with the mumps in the episode Not All Dogs Go to Heaven, including a glass of milk thrown hard enough to knock her unconscious. She has mentioned cutting herself. She has mentioned purging after meals. In the episode Barely Legal, she told her parents she was going upstairs to eat a whole bag of peanuts, which she is allergic to. Her parents stared at her blankly. She said she was allergic to peanuts. They continued to stare blankly. The show moves on. In Road to the North Pole, her Christmas wish was for softer voices in her head. The show treats these details as jokes. They are also a picture of a child in serious distress whose parents do not notice and would not act even if they did. Her mother Lois, who is framed throughout the series as the responsible and caring parent, seldom, if ever, challenges Peter on how he treats Meg. The dynamic the show built is one where Lois sometimes offers Meg a kind word and then does nothing to protect her from the environment that makes those kind words necessary. In multiple episodes, Lois actively puts Meg down herself, criticizing her lack of social popularity and her failure to fit in, which is a particular kind of cruelty from a mother because it confirms the thing Meg is already most afraid of. The show occasionally acknowledges that Lois is not as good a parent as her framing suggests, but it never follows through on that acknowledgement consistently. What makes Meg's situation more than just sad is how specific the show is about her actual capabilities. Meg Griffin is not the hopeless person her family treats her as. The show establishes across multiple episodes that she is talented at bird calls, plays the saxophone well enough that Lisa Simpson gave her one after hearing her play, plays the drums, the cello, and is skilled at bowling, field hockey, basketball, roller derby, and multiple Olympic sports. She excels academically. She is, by most of the show's own evidence, more capable capable and more grounded than any of her family members. Her parents are consistently surprised when they discover she has any skill at all, which tells you exactly how much attention they have been paying. The critical response to how Meg was handled over the years was not kind. Kevin McFarland of the AV Club, writing about the show during its later run, said that instead of doing the harder work of making Meg a more interesting or more funny character, the writers went down the path of least resistance and joined the audience's contempt for her. That observation is precise and worth holding on to. The show did not invent the contempt for Meg and then have it land on the audience. The contempt developed in the audience, and then the writers decided to participate in it rather than push back against it or examine it. The character who was already the most vulnerable person in the family became more so because it was easier than doing something else with her. The show gave Meg a real name for what her family was doing to her in the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which will get its own full examination later. But the moment in that episode where Meg describes herself as the family's lightning rod, the one whose presence absorbs the household's toxicity and keeps everyone else functional, is the closest the show ever came to saying outright what it had been building for years. Meg stays in the family's crosshairs, not because she deserves it, but because the family needs somewhere for everything bad to go. She is the designated recipient. The psychology behind this kind of family arrangement is not invented by the show. It reflects something real about how certain families function. One person, usually the most sensitive or the least powerful, becomes the one on whom the group's stress, anger, and shame gets dumped. It relieves everyone else. It keeps the household from having to look honestly at itself. The show understood this well enough to name it, which makes it all the more striking that naming it did not change anything. Meg apologized. The family went back to treating her the same way. The show returned to using her the same way. Nothing shifted. What shifted instead was Meg herself, and not always in directions the show seems to have planned. The later seasons show Meg developing what the show frames as increasingly dark behavior of her own. She blackmails Chris in the episode Crisscross, starting with small demands and escalating into things that are genuinely disturbing. She develops obsessive attachments to men who show her any kindness at all, including Joe Swanson in The Hand That Rocks the Wheelchair, and Brian after a single kiss in Barely Legal. The show presents these as character traits that are funny because they are extreme. They are also, if you read them with any seriousness, the behavior of a teenager who has received so little genuine warmth from the people responsible for her that any scrap of attention from anyone becomes something she cannot let go of. The show is not subtle about where this comes from. The episode Peter's Sister, which was examined in the first section for what it reveals about Peter, is also the episode that most directly connects what Peter went through to what he did to Meg. When Meg watches Karen abuse Peter and recognizes the pattern, and then helps Peter stand up to Karen, and then receives an apology from Peter who admits he was taking his pain out on her, the show is explicitly saying that Meg's position in the family is not random and not deserved. It is the end point of a chain that started with Francis and ran through Peter. Peter confirms it himself, and then the show largely undoes that moment across later seasons, reverting to the same dynamic as if the conversation had not happened. Mila Kunis has spoken about voicing Meg in interviews. She described the character as being in a constant state of being an awkward 16-year-old, always in the middle of the worst social stretch of adolescence, never getting to move past it. That description is accurate to the show, and also quietly grim. Meg does not age. Meg does not develop in any meaningful or lasting way. She is frozen in the moment of maximum vulnerability, in a house where the people responsible for her have decided, consciously or not, that her pain is more useful to them than her growth would be. The show gave Meg genuine talent in multiple areas, and then made sure her parents never knew about it. It gave her a capacity for loyalty and care that most of her family does not share, and then made sure nobody rewarded it. It showed her in distress, mentioning self-harm and suicidal thoughts, and then made sure nobody in the house took it seriously enough to respond. And it did all of this while framing her as the punchline, which meant that anyone watching could laugh without having to feel the weight of what they were watching. That is the particular thing Family Guy did with Meg that no other animated show quite managed in the same way. It built a portrait of a neglected and mistreated child that was detailed enough and consistent enough to be genuinely troubling, and then surrounded it with enough jokes that the audience could choose not to see it. You could watch Meg's story as a running gag about a girl nobody likes, or you could watch it as a portrait of a family that failed one of its children so completely and for so long that she internalized the failure and started to believe she deserved it. Both readings are available. inevitable, the show put them both there. What it never did, not really, not in any way that lasted, was ask the audience to sit with the second reading long enough to feel what it meant. __quote _to __. And the one episode that came closest to forcing that reckoning, the one that pulled Meg out of the background and put her front and center with everything she had been carrying for 10 seasons, is the episode that reveals the most about what Family Guy actually thought it was doing with all of this. Because in that episode, the show had a choice, and the choice it made says everything. Section 4. Seahorse Seashell Party. The one time the show looked directly at what it was doing. Season 10, Episode 2, October 2nd, 2011. A hurricane is coming to Quahog, and the Griffin family is stuck inside the house together with nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait it out. That is the setup. What follows is the most honest 40 minutes Family Guy ever produced about what it had built inside that house on Spooner Street, and also the most revealing because of what the show chose to do once it had looked directly at the truth and recognized it. The episode has two storylines running alongside each other. Brian secretly eats magic mushrooms and spends the night hallucinating, with Stewie taking care of him. That half of the episode is mostly played for strange comedy and keeps the episode from being entirely about what the other half is about. The other half is about Meg. And what happens with Meg in this episode is unlike anything the show had done with her character before, or would do with her character again in any sustained way. The family is stuck inside. They try to pass the time with games and activities, and none of it works. The boredom and the closeness and the irritation of being trapped together with no relief starts building. And the family does what the family always does when pressure builds. They aim it at Meg. The specific things said to her in this episode are not unusual by Family Guy standards. What is unusual is that this time, Meg does not absorb it quietly. She snaps. After years of being the household's target, after everything the show had put her through across 9.5 seasons, Meg Griffin loses her patience and turns on her family. What follows is one of the most striking sequences in the show's entire run, because Meg does not just yell, she is precise. She goes through each family member one at a time and tells them exactly what they are. She tells Chris that he is a bad brother who has never once taken her side against their parents, that he piles on when the family goes after her instead of showing any loyalty, and that his cruelty toward her is a choice he makes because it is easier than standing up for her. She turns to Lois and tells her that she is a bad mother, that she has watched Peter treat Meg the way he has for years and never stepped in, that her idea of supporting Meg is an occasional kind word that she immediately undercuts by joining the criticism whenever it is convenient for her. And she turns to Peter and tells him that he is a bad father, that his treatment of her is not something she has earned and not something she deserves, and that the man who is supposed to protect her has instead been one of the primary sources of her pain. Every one of these things is accurate. The show had spent 9.5 seasons building the evidence for all of it. Meg is not making accusations the audience cannot verify. She is describing, plainly and precisely, what viewers had watched happen. The family cannot argue with her. They do not argue with her. What happens instead is that the family's anger, without Meg to absorb it, turns inward. Peter starts going after Lois. Lois starts going after Peter. Chris falls apart. The household without its lightning rod immediately collapses into itself. Everyone's worst qualities aimed at each other, rather than at the one person who had been carrying it all. Peter ends up upstairs, genuinely devastated, crying. Lois does not defend him. Chris is shaken. The family, for the first time, is experiencing what Meg experiences routinely, and none of them can handle it. Brian, in his mushroom-induced state, is watching all of this unfold and is the only one who consistently checks on Meg throughout the night, sitting with her, asking how she is doing, treating her like a person whose feelings matter, which is consistent with the show's established dynamic. Brian is not Meg's parent, not even close, but he has always been more attentive to her actual state than anyone in her immediate family. And then comes the ending, and this is the part that matters most. Meg sits with Brian and talks through what has happened. Brian tells her she was right to stand up for herself. He says it clearly and without qualification. He acknowledges that her family has treated her badly and that she did not deserve any of it. For a moment, it seems like the episode might actually land somewhere real. Meg has told the truth. The family has faced it. Someone has confirmed that the truth is true. Then Meg decides to go back and apologize. She tells Brian that she has figured something out. She says that she is the lightning rod, that without her absorbing everything, the family falls apart, that her role in the household is to take the damage so everyone else can function. She frames this not as something being done to her, but as something she is choosing to do, as a kind of sacrifice that keeps the family together. She goes to Peter, to Lois, to Chris, and apologizes for upsetting them. She tells them she was wrong to take her problems out on them. She restores the arrangement exactly as it was. The family accepts the apology. They hug. Everything goes back to normal, and the episode ends. A V-Club critic, Kevin McFarland, reviewed the episode and gave it a D+. He wrote that this far into the show's run, reaching for emotional weight felt like too little, too late, and that one episode of forced explanation for what the show had done to Meg did not change what had been done. Kate Moon at TV Fanatic described Meg's confrontation as contrived and uninteresting. The critical reception was not warm, and the reasons behind that are worth understanding clearly. The episode's problem is not that it acknowledged what the show had been doing to Meg. The acknowledgement is actually the most honest thing Family Guy produced in its later years. The problem is what the show did with the acknowledgement. It had Meg herself be the one to close the door on it. Not Peter, not Lois, not the show taking a hard look at whether the arrangement was going to change. Meg, the person who had been wronged, was written as the one who decided the wrongdoing was actually fine and necessary and would continue. The show looked at the truth and then used the most vulnerable character in the family to make the truth safe again. There is a word for what Meg describes in that conversation with Brian. When a child in a family takes on the job of absorbing everyone else's pain in order to keep the household stable, that is a recognizable pattern. It is not a healthy one. Children who grow up in that role, as the one who exists to make everyone else feel better by giving them someone to be unkind to, typically do not come out of it with a strong sense of their own worth. The show named this pattern accurately, and then it had Meg embrace it voluntarily, which the show framed as maturity and self-awareness on Meg's part when it is actually the opposite. It is a 16-year-old girl talking herself back into a situation she had correctly identified as harmful. Brian's response to Meg's decision is to call her enlightened. He does not push back. He does not tell her that what she is describing is not something a child should have to do. He accepts her reasoning and tells her she is wise. That moment is the episode's most revealing failure, because Brian is the character the show most consistently used to speak sense. When Brian accepts Meg's self-sacrifice as wisdom, the show is endorsing it. It is saying that Meg going back to being the target is the right outcome. The episode that came closest to changing everything ends by confirming that nothing should change. What the episode makes clear, in spite of itself, is that the show knew exactly what it had been doing. The writing in Meg's confrontation scene is too precise, the family's reaction too specific and too accurate for this to be an accident. The writers understood the dynamic they had built. They understood that Meg's position in the family was harmful and unfair, and had real psychological weight, and they chose, deliberately, to preserve it. The episode gave Meg her moment of clarity and then took it away from her, and gave it to the audience instead, so the audience could feel the weight of the situation without the show having to actually do anything about it. The fan response to the episode was divided in a way that reflects this split exactly. Some viewers found it powerful, a rare moment of genuine feeling in a show that had largely moved away from that. Others, particularly in communities where people recognized the family pattern Meg was describing from their own lives, found the ending deeply uncomfortable. Posts in online communities dedicated to people who grew up in households with similar dynamics described watching Meg apologize as genuinely painful to sit through, because it reflected something real and something the show was using carelessly. That discomfort is not incidental. It is the clearest evidence that Seahorse Seashell Party was doing something more than entertainment at its best, and cheapest at its worst. It was drawing on real human experience, the experience of being the one a family uses as its target, and it was drawing on it accurately enough that people who had lived that experience recognized it immediately. The show earned something in that recognition, and then it spent what it had earned on a punchline that put everything back where it was. The episode aired in season 10 and was not revisited in any meaningful way. The dynamic between Meg and her family did not change as a result of what Meg said that night. Peter continued to treat her the same way. Lois continued to watch it happen. Chris continued to pile on when it suited him. Seahorse Seashell Party exists in the show's history as a sealed moment, something that happened and was immediately forgotten by the characters who lived through it, which is perhaps the most accurate thing of all, because that is also what tends to happen in real families built the way the Griffins are built. The truth gets said, the crying happens, and then morning comes and everyone pretends they did not hear it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which is what makes the next question so important. Because the pattern inside the Griffin house, the one Seahorse Seashell Party named and then chose not to break, did not live only in Meg's relationship with Peter. It lived in the whole household, including in the parent the show always held up as the better one. one, the one who was supposed to know better, the one whose failures are quieter and therefore easier to miss. Section 5. Lois Griffin, the parent who was supposed to be different. There is a specific kind of failure that is harder to see than the loud, obvious kind. Peter Griffin's failures as a father are loud. They are physical and verbal and impossible to miss. You watch him throw food at Meg while she is sick in bed, and you do not need anyone to explain to you that something is wrong. The cruelty is right there on the surface, in full color, impossible to look away from. But there is another kind of failure sitting right next to it in the Griffin household. Quieter, and in some ways more damaging, precisely because of how quiet it is. It belongs to Lois, and the show spent over 2 decades pointing at Peter, while Lois stood just behind him, doing her own damage in ways the camera rarely stopped to examine. Lois Patrice Griffin, born Lois Pewterschmidt, is the wife of Peter Griffin, and the mother of Meg, Chris, and Stewie. She is voiced by Alex Borstein, who based the character's voice on a relative. The show frames Lois from the beginning as the competent half of the Griffin marriage. She is the one who keeps the household running. She is the one who understands consequences and tries to moderate Peter's worst impulses. She is the one the show positions as the adult in the room when Peter is at his most chaotic. That framing is real up to a point. Lois is more organized than Peter. She is more socially functional. She is better at navigating the world outside the house. But being more functional than Peter Griffin is not the same as being a good parent. And the evidence the show built up across its run, largely without drawing attention to it, is that Lois failed her children in ways that are specific, repeated, and impossible to explain away as simple mistakes. Start with what the show established about Lois before her children were born. She went through a period of addiction to gambling, introduced in the season 1 episode The Sun Also Draws, when the family visits a Native American casino and Lois develops a compulsive gambling problem. The show treats this as a 1-episode story, but establishes it as a genuine character trait. Across later seasons, various episodes hint that Lois has used drugs, with the clearest example being in the episode Deep Throats, where she reveals she smoked marijuana regularly. Seth MacFarlane confirmed on DVD commentary for that episode that Lois smoked marijuana while she was pregnant with Stewie. That is not a throwaway detail. That is the show's creator confirming that Lois made choices during her pregnancy that she was aware enough to hide later, which tells you something about the gap between how Lois presents herself and what Lois actually does. The episode Hot Shots in season 15 takes Lois's failures as a parent into territory that is genuinely hard to frame as comedy. Lois decides not to vaccinate Stewie against measles. She does not just make this choice for her own family. She becomes an active campaigner, holding rallies and encouraging other parents in Quahog to follow her lead. The result is a measles outbreak that spreads through the town and kills approximately 150 people. Stewie, frightened of being exposed to the disease, runs away. The episode eventually resolves, as Family Guy episodes do, without lasting consequence. But the shape of what Lois did is clear. She made a choice about her child's medical care based on bad information, turned that choice into a public campaign, and people died. Stewie, the child she was supposedly making this choice to protect, was so frightened by the situation his mother created that he fled the house. The pattern the show built around Lois and Meg is subtler than what Peter does, but the show's own evidence makes it plain. Lois does not physically abuse Meg the way Peter does. What she does instead is consistently fail to protect Meg from Peter, and consistently undercut Meg in the moments when Meg most needs her mother to be on her side. In multiple episodes, Lois criticizes Meg's social life, her appearance, her failure to be popular, her inability to attract boys. These are the things Meg is already most insecure about. A mother who points at a child's deepest insecurities and confirms them is not being unkind by accident. She is, whether she means to or not, telling her daughter that the most painful things she believes about herself are true. What makes this worse is the specific way the show frames Lois's behavior. Because Lois is positioned as the good parent, her cruelty toward Meg tends to get read as exasperation rather than as what it actually is. When Peter throws food at Meg, there is no cover. The audience can see what it is. When Lois sighs at Meg's latest social failure, or makes a cutting remark about her daughter's chances with boys, the show's framing softens it. Lois is the reasonable one, so her unkindness registers as a reasonable response to an irritating situation, rather than as a mother failing her child. The academic therapy assessment that was written about the Griffin family as a course exercise, working from the show's established facts, identified something precise about this. It noted that Lois also suffered being ignored by her parents growing up. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is one of the wealthiest men in the show's world, and one of the coldest. He has never been a warm or present present parent to Lois. The pattern of a parent who was not seen by their own parents, failing to truly see their children, is the same pattern the show traced with Peter and Francis. The show built it into both parents, and then pointed the camera almost exclusively at Peter's version of it. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, appears throughout the series as a man of enormous wealth and almost no warmth. He is dismissive of Peter to a degree that goes well beyond reasonable dislike of a son-in-law. He is controlling and cold with Lois herself. He treats the Griffin children as extensions of the family's financial arrangement, rather than as people he has any genuine relationship with. In the season 13 episode Finders Keepers, Carter decides that Chris would be the best heir to his fortune, which leads to the episode Fresh Air, in which Peter's response is so extreme it will get its own examination later in this essay. The point here is that Lois grew up with a father who valued money and status over everything, who showed her that affection is transactional and warmth is a sign of weakness. She married Peter Griffin and has spent her adult life being the functional one in a marriage where functionality is the bare minimum. That is not a foundation that produces a particularly attentive or emotionally present parent. The show gave Lois a moment in season 14's A Lot Going On Upstairs that strips away the competent parent framing almost entirely. Peter turns the attic into a space for himself and his friends, neglecting the family in the process. Lois eventually snaps. She uses a drill to seal Peter and his friends inside the attic, trapping them in an unventilated space for hours, and only releases them when Peter threatens to damage her wedding dress. The show plays this as Lois reaching her limit with Peter's childishness, but what it actually shows is a woman who, when pushed to her breaking point, responds with behavior that is dangerous and controlling. She locks people in a room. She only lets them out when something she values is threatened. That is not the behavior of the competent, rational parent the show claims Lois is. There is also the episode Breaking Out is Hard to Do in season 4, which is built entirely around Lois being arrested for shoplifting. She had been stealing things repeatedly from stores around Quahog. This is not a single impulsive mistake. It is a sustained pattern of behavior that she hid from her family until it became impossible to hide. She goes to prison. The family has to manage without her. The episode resolves with Lois back home and the family glad to have her. The kleptomania is treated as an episode-length character flaw that gets wrapped up by the credits, rather than as something worth examining in terms of what it means about the kind of person Lois actually is beneath the surface. The show was not unaware of the gap between who Lois claimed to be and who she sometimes was. There are episodes that gesture toward it, but the show's structure consistently protected Lois from genuine examination in the way it protected almost no other character. Peter got examined, at least in the early seasons. Brian got examined, sometimes harshly. Stewie got examined. Meg certainly got examined, though usually through the lens of what was wrong with her rather than what was being done to her. Lois moved through the show mostly insulated from the kind of sustained, honest look the show occasionally turned on others. What the show did document, clearly and repeatedly, is that Lois saw what was happening to Meg and did not stop it. This is not ambiguous. It is there in episode after episode. Peter belittles Meg. Lois watches. Peter excludes Meg. Lois watches. Peter physically mistreats Meg. Lois is in the house. The show's own established logic, confirmed in Seahorse Seashell Party, is that Lois was aware of the dynamic and chose not to disrupt it. Meg's confrontation with Lois in that episode is specifically about this. She does not accuse Lois of being cruel in the way Peter is cruel. She accuses her of watching it happen and doing nothing. Lois does not deny it. A parent who watches their child be mistreated and does not intervene is participating in the mistreatment. The show understood this well enough to have Meg say it out loud. It did not understand it well enough to change the dynamic, or to examine Lois's inaction with the same attention it occasionally gave to Peter's actions. The failure of the quieter parent is harder to see, and the show used that difficulty as a way to let Lois off the hook repeatedly. There is something particularly sharp in the fact that the show established Lois as a woman who had experienced her own version of not being seen. Her father did not truly see her. Her upbringing, according to the therapy assessment framing drawn from the show's own established history, involved being overlooked in ways that shaped her. She knew what it felt like to be in a household where the people responsible for you were not paying the right kind of attention. She had that knowledge, and she still watched it happen to Meg without stopping it. That is the specific tragedy of Lois Griffin, that the show never quite sat still long enough to examine. Not that she was a villain, not that she was as overtly damaging as Peter, but that she was a woman who had all the information she needed to be a different kind of mother, and consistently chose the easier path instead. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the easier path in the Griffin household was always to leave Meg where she was. Because if Lois had to deal with Stewie, and Stewie's actual condition as a child being raised in that house is something the show documented in ways that are stranger and more troubling than almost anything else it produced, then there was simply not enough attention left over. What the show built around Stewie, and what it revealed about how the Griffins parented their youngest child, is a story that does not make any of this look better. Section 6. Baby Not on Board. Negligence as Comedy, and What That Costs. There is a specific kind of joke that Family Guy returned to across its entire run, and it is worth naming directly before getting into the episode that makes it most visible. The joke works like this. A child is placed in danger. The danger is real enough to be recognizable. The adults responsible for the child either cause the danger through their own carelessness or respond to it in ways that make it worse. And then the whole thing is framed as comedy, which gives the audience permission to laugh rather than to sit with what they are actually watching. The joke works because animation creates distance. Because cartoon children do not bleed the way real children do. Because the bright colors and the comedic music and the cutaway gags build a cushion between the event and its weight. But the event is still there underneath the cushion. And Baby Not on Board, Season 7, Episode 4, is the clearest and most sustained version of this particular joke that Family Guy ever produced. The setup is simple. Peter has been given a coupon for unlimited free gas for a year by Carl, the convenience store clerk where Chris works. The circumstances of how Peter gets the coupon are worth noting because they establish the episode's relationship with Peter's parenting from the very first scene. Chris is working at the store and tries to ask his father for advice about his own body, about something personal he is going through as a teenager. Peter does not hear the question as a son reaching out to his father. He decides, without listening properly, that Chris has made a sexually inappropriate comment and threatens to sue the store for harassment. Carl gives Peter the gas coupon to make him go away. The scene is played as a joke about Peter being oblivious and litigious. It is also a scene in which a teenage boy tries to talk to his father about something he clearly finds confusing and difficult, and his father not only ignores him, but weaponizes the attempt. The essay will come back to Chris in more detail in the next section. For now, it is enough to note that the episode announces its parenting theme in its very first scene and does not let go of it. Lois decides the family should use the free gas to take a road trip to the Grand Canyon. Everyone packs up and gets ready to leave early the next morning. Stewie, who is a toddler and therefore dependent on the adults in his household to keep track of him, had been up late the night before and was exhausted. He wandered from his car seat back into the house to sleep while the family was loading the car. Nobody noticed. The family drove away. They did not notice Stewie was missing for a significant portion of the drive. The moment Lois realizes Stewie is not in the car happens when the family stops at Ground Zero in New York City. That is how far they drove before anyone checked whether all three of their children were in the vehicle. They traveled from Quahog, Rhode Island to New York City without a single person in the car registering that their youngest child, a toddler, was not present. The show uses the Ground Zero stop as a comedic beat in its own right, built around Peter not understanding what Ground Zero is. But the structural fact underneath the joke is that the Griffins drove for hours and crossed state lines before anyone confirmed that their infant was with them. When Lois realizes Stewie is missing, she wants to turn around immediately. This is the moment the episode uses to establish where Peter's priorities sit. Peter resists turning back. He argues against returning home to their toddler. He does not want to abandon the vacation. Lois has to push back against her husband's reluctance to go home to the child they left behind before he eventually agrees. The show frames Peter's resistance as a running joke about his immaturity and his commitment to a good time. It is also a scene in which a father genuinely argues, even briefly, against prioritizing his infant's safety over his own plans. They contact their neighbors, Cleveland and Quagmire, and ask them to go to the house and check on Stewie. Cleveland and Quagmire go to the house. When they enter, Stewie mistakes them for intruders. He had already been awake and alone long enough to feel threatened by unexpected visitors. He uses a noxious gas to knock both men out. Then, having realized who they are, he chains them to the wall in the basement and forces them to watch the DirecTV help channel on a continuous loop, rather than allowing them to take care of him. This choice on Stewie's part is played as a joke about Stewie's personality. It also means that the backup plan the Griffins put in place to care for their infant failed, and the adults who were supposed to take over for the absent parents were incapacitated by the child they were sent to help. Left genuinely alone now, with no food and no one looking after him, Stewie works through everything the house has to offer. He eats all of the food. He runs out. He has no way to get more food. He is a toddler in an empty house with no groceries and no adults. The show resolves this by having Stewie apply for a job at a fast food restaurant called McBurgertown to earn money to feed himself. He is fired for eating food on the job. The scene is constructed as physical comedy, and the image of a toddler behind a fast food counter is genuinely absurd in the way Family Guy absurdity often works. But underneath the absurdity, what the episode is describing is an infant who ran out of food and had to attempt to solve the problem himself because every adult responsible for him had either left, been knocked unconscious, or was still driving around trying to get back. Meanwhile, the family's journey home is a sustained study in how Peter makes every situation worse. He somehow gets into the car, driving alongside the family, and watches a movie, taking his attention entirely off the road, which causes the Griffins' car to crash. When they try to take a train home, Peter spends the last of the money they had for tickets on helium shower curtain rings. These are not useful items. They are novelty objects. Peter buys novelty objects with the money that was supposed to get his family home to their abandoned toddler. Brian eventually manages to get the family a ride home in the back of a pickup truck. The episode ends with the Griffins returning home and reuniting with Stewie. The reunion is scored with an instrumental version of Somewhere in My Memory, the John Williams piece from Home Alone, which is the film the episode is deliberately referencing throughout. The Home Alone connection is worth sitting with because it tells you exactly how the show wanted the audience to frame what they were watching. Home Alone is a movie about a child accidentally left behind who takes care of himself with ingenuity and humor. It is a fantasy of childhood competence, and it works because the film is very careful to establish that the parents are frantic to get back to their son and that the situation is genuinely accidental. The comedy comes from Kevin McAllister's cleverness, not from the parents' negligence. Family Guy uses the same basic situation, but with the emotional weight reversed. The comedy in Baby Not on Board comes at least as much from the parents' failures as from Stewie's resourcefulness. Peter arguing against going back, Peter wasting the ticket money, the long stretch of driving before anyone checked whether the baby was in the car. The show is not framing Peter and Lois the way Home Alone frames the McAllister parents. It is framing their negligence as the joke, which is a meaningfully different thing. There is a reading of the episode that tries to let the Griffins off the hook by pointing out that Stewie made things worse for himself. He knocked out the neighbors who came to help him. He chained them in the basement. If he had simply let Cleveland and Quagmire in, he would have been taken care of. This reading is accurate as far as it goes. Stewie did make choices that removed his own safety net, but a toddler making poor decisions when frightened and alone is not a defense of the adults who left him alone and frightened in the first place. The fact that Stewie is capable of defending himself with noxious gas does not change the fact that his parents drove to New York before noticing he was not in the car. The episode received mixed reviews when it aired. Critics noted the Home Alone references and generally treated it as a moderately entertaining entry in the season. What the mixed response reveals is how effectively the comedy packaging worked. The episode's humor is competent enough that you can watch it and register it primarily as a funny episode about Stewie being home alone. The parenting failure underneath the comedy is so thoroughly wrapped in jokes that it takes a deliberate effort to see it clearly. That deliberate effort is worth making, because Baby Not on Board is not an isolated incident in the show's history. It is an example of a pattern. The pattern is that the Griffin children are regularly placed in situations of genuine danger or distress through their parents' negligence. The situations are packaged as comedy, and the packaging allows the show to avoid examining what the situations actually represent. Stewie being left home alone is funny. A toddler running out of food and attempting to get a job to feed himself is funny. Peter spending the ticket money on novelty items while his infant is alone in an empty house is funny. The jokes land, the laughter happens, and the question of what it means that these are the parents this child has gets swallowed by the next cutaway. The cost of this kind of comedy is not visible in any single episode. It accumulates. Each individual instance can be read as absurdist humor, as a one-time gag, as the show pushing things further than normal television would go because that is what Family Guy does. But taken together, across the full run of the series, the picture that builds is of two parents who consistently fail to prioritize their children's physical safety and who face no meaningful consequences for it. The show's audience was invited to laugh at the gap between what parenting is supposed to look like and what Peter and Lois actually did. Most of the time, the audience accepted the invitation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the Baby Not on Board pattern significant to the larger story this essay is telling is where it sits in relation addition to the other failures happening in the Griffin household. The physical negligence, the forgetting, the choosing novelty items over train tickets is the most visible layer, but underneath it, in the same house, a different and quieter kind of neglect was operating on a different child. The kind where the child is not forgotten. The kind where the child is seen clearly every day, and the parent's response to what they see is to look away. And the child in that situation, the one who is present and noticed and still somehow invisible, is the one whose story reveals the most about what it means when consequences stop working in a family. Section 7. The consequences that never come. Family Guy's broken moral ecosystem. Every story has rules. Not the kind of rules that get written down anywhere, but the kind that the audience learns simply by watching. In a show like The Simpsons, one of the earliest rules the audience learns is that Homer Simpson might do something terrible, but by the end of the episode, something will have shifted. He will understand what he did. He will try to fix it. The relationship between the action and its consequence is intact, even when the consequence is small or imperfect or arrives too late to undo everything. That intact relationship is what makes the bad behavior mean something. It is what tells the audience that the show has a moral center, a sense of where things should point, even when the characters are pointing in the wrong direction. Family Guy had this in its early seasons. Not perfectly, not as consistently as The Simpsons built it, but the bones of a moral ecosystem were there. Peter would do something that hurt his family. The episode would follow the damage. Something resembling a reckoning would arrive. It was not sophisticated storytelling, and it was not always earned, but it was present. The show understood, in that early period, that behavior without consequence is not comedy. It is just behavior. And behavior without consequence, repeated across enough episodes, stops being something the audience reads as a portrait of a flawed man, and starts being something they read as a portrait of how things are supposed to work. That shift, from consequence present to consequence absent, is the central thing that happened to Family Guy's parenting story across its run. And tracking exactly how and when the consequences disappeared tells you more about what the show was doing with the Griffin family than almost any individual episode can. In the season 1 episode, I Never Met the Dead Man, Peter accidentally causes the town of Quahog to lose its television reception. The family is forced to actually be present with each other. The episode uses this as a way to examine what Peter's passive, checked-out style of fatherhood has cost his family. He becomes more engaged without the television. He goes outside with his kids. He is present in ways he normally is not. The show treats the more engaged Peter as genuinely better, as something worth having. When the television access is restored, there is a real sense of loss in the episode's framing, a recognition that the distraction the television provides is part of what keeps Peter from being the father he could be. The consequence of losing the television is an improved Peter. The consequence of getting it back is losing that improvement. That is a moral ecosystem working correctly. The show is saying that Peter's inattention costs his family something real. Compare that to the season 14 episode, A Fistful of Meg, in which Peter has changed Meg's legal name on her birth certificate to Megatron without her knowledge or consent. This is presented as a reveal, a funny piece of backstory that explains something about Meg's life. There is no consequence for Peter having done this. There is no moment where the show acknowledges that a father altering his daughter's identity on an official document as a joke without telling her is a thing that has weight. It is just information. The show delivers it and moves on. That is not a moral ecosystem. That is a show that has stopped asking what things mean. The term that best describes what happened to Peter Griffin across the show's run is a karma Houdini. The idea behind the term is simple: a character who does harmful things and consistently escapes any real accounting for them. The early Peter was not this. The early Peter faced consequences that were proportional to, or at least in the same neighborhood as, what he had done. The later Peter operated in a world where the connection between action and consequence had been quietly cut. He could physically harm his children, waste money the family needed, make decisions that endangered the people around him, and walk away from all of it without anything meaningful landing on him. This matters for the parenting story, specifically because children who grow up in households where a parent's harmful behavior has no consequence learn something from that absence. They learn that the behavior is acceptable. They learn that the adults around them are not governed by the same rules they are being asked to follow. They learn that love and damage can come from the same person, and that there is nothing they can do about it. The Griffin children, particularly Meg, lived inside exactly this structure. Peter's treatment of them had no lasting consequence, which means the lesson those children absorbed across season after season was that this was simply how things were. The show itself demonstrated that it understood this on at least one occasion. In the episode where Peter becomes more intelligent and self-aware, unaware, the family tries to revert him to his previous state. The logic inside the show's world is that the broken, consequence-free Peter is the version the family has organized itself around, and a Peter who behaves differently disrupts the arrangement. That is the show's moral ecosystem turning on itself. It is a story where the characters actively resist improvement, because improvement would require everyone to adjust, and adjustment is harder than staying in the familiar pattern, even when the familiar pattern is harmful. What makes this particularly striking is that the show built it in consciously. The writers knew that Peter becoming a better parent would require the show to change. The running jokes that drove a significant portion of the comedy depended on Peter being the way he was. The cutaway gags, the absurdist situations, the extreme behavior that pushed further than other animated shows would go. All of it required a Peter who did not learn and did not change. So the show built in a mechanism for keeping him exactly where he was. The family's resistance to an improved Peter is that mechanism. It is the show protecting its own comedic structure at the expense of its moral one. The specific episodes where this mechanism is most visible tend to follow the same pattern. Peter encounters an experience that changes him. He becomes more thoughtful, or more present, or more careful. The family, or the show's structure, or both, push back against the change. Peter reverts. The episode ends with everything where it started. This pattern is so consistent across the show's run that it stops feeling like individual episode plotting and starts feeling like a policy. The show had a policy about Peter Griffin. He was not going to change in any lasting way. And since his failures as a parent were built on who he was, rather than on what he did in any individual episode, the policy about his character was also a policy about his children's experience of him. Meg's experience of this policy is the most documented in the show's canon. As Section 3 and Section 4 of this essay established, the one moment the show came closest to breaking its own policy was Seahorse Seashell Party, where Meg named the dynamic clearly, and the family was forced to face it, and then the policy reasserted itself. By the next episode, and certainly by the next season, Peter was treating Meg the same way he had always treated her. The consequence of Seahorse Seashell Party was nothing, which is exactly what the show's moral ecosystem produces when it is operating as designed in the later seasons. Nothing. There is a specific scene in the episode April and Quahog where Peter tells Lois plainly that he hates being around his kids because they do not do anything and are not entertaining to him. The show plays this as a throwaway line. In the early seasons, that sentiment might have driven an entire episode about what Peter's disengagement costs his children. In the later seasons, it is just something Peter says, and the scene moves on. The distance between those two versions of the same statement is the distance between a show with a working moral ecosystem and a show that has given up on maintaining one. The consequence-free structure also shaped how the show handled moments when the children themselves were harmed in ways that would, in any realistic context, produce lasting effects. Meg mentions cutting herself, and there is no consequence. She mentions throwing up after meals, and there is no consequence. She makes statements that suggest she has thought about hurting herself, and there is no consequence. Peter physically injures her in multiple episodes, and there is no consequence. The show built a child who is showing recognizable signs of serious distress and placed her in a household where the adults either do not notice or do not respond, and then declined to examine what that environment produces, because examining it would require consequences. And the later seasons of Family Guy had decided that consequences were not part of the arrangement. Chris is part of this story too, though his version of it is less visible than Meg's. In the episode Baby Not on Board, Chris tries to talk to his father about something personal, and Peter turns it into a lawsuit threat. There is no consequence for Peter's failure to be present in that moment. Chris simply absorbs it, the way the Griffin children absorb everything, and the episode moves on to the next joke. The show documented Chris having genuine talents in art and music in the early seasons. By the later seasons, those talents had been largely written away, which is its own kind of consequence-free erasure. The show took something from Chris and did not acknowledge the taking. Stewie's position in this ecosystem is the strangest and in some ways the most revealing. The show's own creators stated that Peter and Lois noticed Stewie's behavior, including his elaborate schemes and his emotional states, but treat it as meaningless because he is a baby. This is confirmed as a deliberate creative decision rather than oversight. The consequence of this parental posture is that Stewie operates in complete isolation from any meaningful adult engagement. His primary relationship is with Brian, the family dog. The adults in the house are not absent in the way they are sometimes absent from Meg's experience. They are present and consciously disengaged. They see Stewie and decide not to take what they see seriously. That decision, made every day in the Griffin household, is a parenting choice. choice. And it produces no consequence in the show's world because the show had stopped producing consequences. What a broken moral ecosystem does to a story is something that accumulates over time, rather than arriving in a single moment. Early Family Guy had enough of a moral structure that individual episodes could feel satisfying even when they were dark, because the darkness was in conversation with something. The later seasons lost that conversation. The darkness remained. The behavior remained. But the structure that gave the behavior meaning was gone. What was left was a family doing real damage to each other and to their children, inside a frame that had been designed to make sure none of it counted. __, quote _6 __, and the child in that family who most clearly did not count, whose experience the show documented most thoroughly and then declined to take seriously, was not Meg in those later seasons alone. It was also the one child in the Griffin house who has been overlooked in almost every serious conversation about Family Guy's parenting. The one whose position in the household is genuinely unlike any of his siblings, and whose story involves a different and arguably more precise kind of neglect than anything the show did with Meg or Chris or Stewie separately. Section 8. Chris Griffin, the child nobody analyzed. There is a tendency, when people talk about the parenting failures inside the Griffin household, to talk about Meg. That is understandable. Meg's story is the most visible, the most sustained, and the most directly addressed by the show itself. But focusing entirely on Meg means missing something that is sitting right next to her, in the same house, at the same dinner table, experiencing its own version of being raised by Peter and Lois Griffin. Chris Griffin is the middle child, the only son, and the character the show most consistently forgot to take seriously. And what the show documented about Chris across its run, largely without drawing attention to it, is a portrait of a child who started with more than anyone around him noticed and ended up with considerably less, in ways that had everything to do with the parents who were supposed to be watching. Christopher Cross Griffin is the second child of Peter and Lois. He is voiced by Seth Green, who based the character's voice on Buffalo Bill from the thriller film The Silence of the Lambs, which he demonstrated during his audition. Chris is a heavyset teenager attending James Woods Regional High School in Quahog, the same school as his older sister, Meg. The show establishes early that he was born because of a broken condom, and that the money from the lawsuit against the manufacturer is what gave Peter and Lois the money to buy the house on Spooner Street. This detail, which the show delivers as a joke in one of its earliest seasons, means that Chris's existence is financially tied to the house in a way that gives the whole arrangement a strange quality. The Griffin family home was purchased with money that came from the accident of Chris's conception. He was not planned, he was not expected, and the house that was supposed to shelter him was bought with the evidence of that. In the early seasons, the show built Chris with a genuine interior life that set him apart from how he eventually ended up. He was established as having real artistic talent. He could draw and paint with a skill that surprised people who expected nothing from him. In the episode A Picture's Worth $1,000, his painting catches the attention of an art dealer in New York, and the episode follows Peter's response to the discovery that his son is genuinely gifted. Peter's initial response is to try to exploit the talent for money, rather than to simply be proud of his child, which is consistent with the early Peter's character, a man whose love for his children is real, but whose way of expressing it is consistently off. The episode acknowledges the talent as real. It treats Chris's ability as something worth taking seriously, even as it filters that seriousness through Peter's particular kind of mismanagement. This matters because it establishes something about Chris that the show later abandoned. He was not simply the dumb, awkward teenage boy the later seasons reduced him to. He was a kid with something going on underneath the surface, something his parents were not equipped to properly nurture, but which the show, in its early seasons, was at least interested in acknowledging. The abandonment of that interior life across the later seasons is not simply a writing choice made in isolation. It is consistent with the show's broader pattern of removing depth from its characters as it moved away from examining them towards simply using them. The scene in Baby Not on Board that opens this particular chapter of Chris's relationship with his father is worth returning to now, with fresh attention. Chris is working at the convenience store. Peter comes in. Chris attempts to ask his father for advice about something personal, something to do with his own body and what he is experiencing as a teenager going through puberty. This is exactly the kind of conversation a son might reasonably try to have with his father. It requires the father to be present enough to hear what his son is actually asking. Peter does not hear it. He interprets the question as a sexual comment directed at him, announces he is being harassed, and threatens to sue the store. Carl, the store manager, gives Peter a year of free gas to make him leave. The joke lands because Peter's misunderstanding is absurd absurd. But the scene underneath the joke is a teenage boy attempting to reach out to his father about something he clearly finds confusing or difficult, and having that attempt not only ignored, but turned into a situation where Peter benefits financially from the failure to listen. Chris walked away from that interaction with nothing he needed. Peter walked away with a coupon. The show does not return to what Chris was trying to ask. The conversation simply ends, swallowed by the next plot beat, and whatever Chris needed to talk about stays unaddressed. This pattern of Chris's genuine needs getting lost in the noise of whatever Peter is doing runs through the show in a way that is easy to miss, precisely because Chris does not react to it the way Meg does. Meg's distress is visible. She expresses it, sometimes in extreme ways, sometimes in ways the show plays for dark comedy, but it is there, on the surface, where the audience can see it. Chris does not express his distress in the same way. He absorbs things more quietly. He goes along with the household's rhythms rather than pushing against them. And the show read that quietness as the absence of anything worth examining, which meant that what was happening to Chris stayed largely invisible. The episode Forefather in the early seasons shows Peter giving Chris away, not in a complicated or ambiguous way. Peter decides he has failed at being Chris's father and essentially gives his son to Cleveland to raise instead. The episode resolves before this becomes permanent, but the fact of it is there. Peter, faced with evidence of his own inadequacy as a parent, chooses to remove the child rather than address the inadequacy. This is not the behavior of a man who is simply bumbling his way through fatherhood. It is the behavior of a man who responds to his own parenting failures by treating the child as the problem. Peter's relationship with Chris across the early seasons has moments that suggest something warmer underneath the fumbling. There are episodes where Peter genuinely tries to connect with his son, where he goes to talk to the parents of a bully who is making Chris's life difficult, where he attempts, imperfectly and often badly, to be present in his son's experience. These moments exist, and they matter because they are consistent with the early show's portrait of Peter as a man who loves his children in ways he does not know how to express properly. The love is real, the tools are not there. That gap is the tragedy of the early Peter as a father, and it applied to Chris as much as to anyone. By the later seasons, the gap had been replaced by something else. Chris, in the later years of the show, takes an active role in mistreating Meg. He joins the family's pattern of using her as the target. He capitalizes on her falsely reported death in the episode Better Off Meg to gain popularity at school. And when she comes back alive, he kidnaps her to prevent her return from disrupting the social status he has gained. The show plays this as sibling rivalry pushed to a comedic extreme. It is also a scene in which a teenage boy kidnaps his sister to preserve his own social position, and the show treats it as broadly funny, rather than as something that tells you anything meaningful about what the Griffin household produced in its children. The therapy assessment written about the Griffin family, drawn from the show's own established facts, identified Chris as someone who had shown genuine anger during the first session of family therapy, blaming Meg for the fact that the family was in therapy at all. That detail is specific and revealing. Chris, when placed in a situation where the family's dysfunction is being examined by an outside party, responds by directing his anger at Meg. He has absorbed the household's established patterns so thoroughly that even in a therapeutic setting, his first instinct is to treat his sister as the source of the problem, rather than as a fellow person living inside the same difficult environment. What this shows is something the show documented without analyzing. The Griffin household did not only damage Meg, it shaped Chris in ways that made him a participant in that damage. He did not enter the world as someone who would naturally mistreat his sister. He became someone who did it because the household he grew up in modeled it as normal. Peter treated Meg as the target. Lois watched and did not intervene, and Chris learned, across years of living in that environment, that this was the household's operating logic. When you are not the target, you join the targeting. It is safer and easier than being the one who pushes back. The show established that none of the Griffin children were planned. Meg came from failed birth control. Chris came from a broken condom. Stewie, the show reveals, actually used time travel to engineer his own conception, which is its own strange thing entirely. But the pattern of unplanned children being raised by two people who were not prepared for them is a consistent thread across all three siblings. What that means in practice is that Peter and Lois became parents not through deliberate choice and preparation, but through circumstance, and raised their children in a household that reflected that. Not monstrous, in the early years at least, but underprepared in ways that produced specific and traceable damage in each of the three children who grew up there. Chris's damage is the least examined. It is also, in some ways, the most instructive, because Chris is the child who most clearly shows what the Griffin household produces when it is not producing the most most extreme version of its effects. Meg got the worst of it. Chris got a quieter version. He lost his artistic depth as the show went on. He lost the moments of genuine emotional intelligence the early seasons gave him. He became, by the later years, a simpler and cruder version of himself. He started participating in the household's cruelty rather than standing apart from it. And he did all of this without anyone inside the show or outside it paying very much attention, because everyone was watching Meg. The child nobody analyzed is also the child whose trajectory most clearly shows the household's effect when it has time to work slowly and without drama. Meg's story is dramatic because the damage was concentrated and visible. Chris's story is quieter because the damage was distributed, absorbed gradually, expressed in the slow disappearance of things he used to have, the artistic talent, the sensitivity, the moments of reaching toward his father for something real. All of it diminished. And Peter and Lois, who were responsible for the environment that produced that diminishment, were never asked by the show to account for what happened to their son. Quote _7_. The child who was asked to account for almost nothing, whose existence in the household was treated as the show's strangest and most sustained joke, whose real situation in the Griffin house is more troubling than almost anything else the show produced, is the one who has been sitting in a crib at the center of this story the whole time. And what the show documented about who actually raised that child, and what it meant that the answer was not his parents, is where the parenting story inside Family Guy gets most strange. Section 9. Stewie Griffin and the parent the show actually gave him. There is a question that sits underneath every scene involving Stewie Griffin and his family, and the show never asks it directly, even though it answers it clearly across hundreds of episodes. The question is this: who is actually raising this child? Not in the legal sense, not in the sense of who feeds him and changes his diapers and puts him to bed, though those things are their own story, but in the deeper sense of who is present with Stewie in the ways that matter. Who notices what he is going through? Who sits with him when something is wrong? Who treats what he says and feels as worth taking seriously? The show answers this question the same way in almost every episode it produces across its entire run. The answer is Brian, the family dog. That answer is funny. It is meant to be funny. The image of a talking dog as the most emotionally present figure in a toddler's life is absurd in the specific way that Family Guy absurdity works, built on the gap between what a normal household looks like and what the Griffin household actually is. But underneath the absurdity, the show documented something real. Stewie Griffin grew up in a household with two parents who were consistently, deliberately, and by the show's own admission, unavailable to him in the ways that a child most needs a parent to be available. And the relationship he built with Brian in the absence of that parental presence is the most sustained and honest emotional relationship the show produced across its entire run. Stuart Gilligan Griffin is the youngest child of Peter and Lois. He is voiced by Seth MacFarlane, who based the character's voice on the English actor Rex Harrison, particularly Harrison's performance in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady. Stewie was conceived, as the show eventually reveals, through a time travel event in which Stewie himself went back and engineered his own conception. He was not planned by his parents. His existence is, by the show's internal logic, something Stewie brought about himself before he was born, which is a strange and funny piece of mythology that also quietly establishes that Stewie entered the world without being genuinely wanted or expected by the two people responsible for him. The show's creators address the question of why Peter and Lois do not respond to Stewie's clearly unusual behavior directly. The answer, confirmed as a deliberate creative decision rather than an oversight, is that Peter and Lois do notice what Stewie says and does. They see it. They simply do not take it seriously because he is a baby. This is important to understand clearly. The show is not saying that Peter and Lois are unaware of Stewie's inner life. It is saying that they are aware of it and have decided it does not count. The choice to dismiss what a child is experiencing because the child is young is a parenting choice. It is one that Peter and Lois make consistently, and it shapes everything about Stewie's experience of the household. What Stewie's inner life actually contains, as the show documents it, is considerable. He is extraordinarily intelligent. He builds functional time machines, mind control devices, and various other pieces of technology that would be remarkable coming from an adult engineer with decades of training. He speaks multiple languages. He has a sophisticated understanding of art, music, and culture. He experiences genuine emotions, including loneliness, fear, attachment, and grief, with a depth and complexity that none of the adults around him acknowledge. In the episode Road to the North Pole, his Christmas wish is for softer voices in his head. The show delivers this as a dark joke. It is also a toddler describing something that sounds like significant psychological distress in a household where the adults have decided his inner life does not merit serious attention. The relationship between Stewie and Brian developed across the show's run into something the show seemed to recognize as its most reliable source of genuine feeling. The Road to episodes, which follow Brian and Stewie on various adventures together, beginning with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, are consistently among the most critically praised and fan-beloved entries in the show's catalog. The reason is not difficult to understand. These episodes give Stewie a companion who actually engages with him. Brian talks to Stewie. Brian responds to what Stewie says. Brian takes Stewie's feelings seriously in a way that no one else in the Griffin household does with any consistency. Road to Rhode Island is the episode where the foundation of the Brian and Stewie relationship gets established most clearly. Stewie has been sent to stay with Lois's parents, and Brian is sent to retrieve him. The trip back becomes an extended journey that forces the two characters into genuine closeness. They talk, they argue, they discover things about each other. For Stewie, whose daily experience in the Griffin household involves being surrounded by people who have decided he does not need to be taken seriously, having an extended period of genuine engagement with someone who actually listens is visibly meaningful. The episode ends with Brian and Stewie having formed something real, a bond built on actual mutual attention, rather than on the household's default mode of ignoring the youngest child. By the time of Seahorse Seashell Party in Season 10, the Brian and Stewie dynamic is so established that it feels natural for Brian to spend the entire night looking after Stewie while he hallucinates on magic mushrooms. Brian does not hand this responsibility off. He does not decide it is not his job. He stays with Stewie, keeps him calm, brings him water, stays present through the whole frightening experience. Meanwhile, Peter and Lois are in another part of the house, playing games and eventually turning their frustrations on Meg. Brian, the dog, is the one sitting with the toddler in distress. This is not treated as remarkable by the episode. It is simply what Brian does, which tells you everything about how the household's care responsibilities have actually been distributed. The show established in multiple episodes that Lois's relationship with Stewie contains a specific kind of complicated feeling that goes beyond simple neglect. In the show's earliest seasons, Stewie's primary goal was to kill Lois. He built elaborate schemes to end her life, expressed consistent hatred for her, and treated her as an obstacle to his freedom and his plans. The show played this as dark comedy, the absurdist image of a homicidal infant. What sits underneath the comedy, if you read it with any seriousness, is a toddler whose relationship with his mother had curdled into something hostile very early in his life. The show eventually moved Stewie away from the matricidal storylines, with McFarlane noting that the character had evolved, and the original premise no longer fit who Stewie had become. But the early seasons built a child who did not feel safe with his mother, and the later seasons replaced that with a child who simply felt invisible to her. Peter's relationship with Stewie is different from his relationship with Meg or Chris, partly because Stewie is so much younger, and partly because Stewie's capabilities make him a less straightforward target. Peter cannot bully Stewie the way he bullies Meg, partly because Stewie is willing and able to retaliate in ways that Peter cannot predict or manage. What the show documents instead is a consistent parental absence. Peter does not know what is happening with Stewie on any given day. In the episode Stewie is enceinte, when a neighbor asks Peter whether his baby is pregnant, Peter's response is that he does not know and that Lois is usually in charge of the kids. He says this casually, as if it is a perfectly reasonable answer. His infant's physical condition is not something Peter tracks. That is Lois's department, and Peter has simply decided that anything involving the children's actual state is someone else's responsibility. This exchange captures something important about how parental neglect operates in the Griffin household when it comes to Stewie specifically. It is not dramatic, it is not violent. It is the quiet, everyday version of not being there. The version where a parent has simply decided that keeping track of a child's physical and emotional state is not their job. Peter did not make a decision to be disengaged from Stewie. He just never made a decision to be engaged, which produces the same outcome with less visible drama. Lois's relationship with Stewie in the middle and later seasons settles into something that looks like affection, but operates more like management. She feeds him. She puts him to bed. She goes through the physical motions of caring for a young child. What she does not do consistently is actually engage with who Stewie is. The show's own confirmed creative logic states that she sees his behavior and has decided it is not worth taking seriously. That means Lois is not absent from Stewie's life in the way she is sometimes absent from Meg's or Chris's experiences. She is present and choosing not to engage, choosing not to take seriously what she can plan plainly see. That is a more precise kind of neglect than simply not being there, because it involves looking directly at a child and deciding that what you see does not require a response. What Brian provides that neither Peter nor Lois provides is genuine engagement. He talks to Stewie as if what Stewie says matters. He responds to Stewie's emotional states as if they are real and worth responding to. He stays present through difficult moments rather than delegating the difficulty to someone else. He is interested in Stewie as a person rather than as a small body that needs to be fed and managed. In a household where the adults have agreed, apparently without discussion, that the youngest child's inner life is not worth serious attention, Brian's consistent engagement is not simply a funny character dynamic. It is the closest thing to genuine parenting that Stewie receives. The tragedy in this, and it is a tragedy even at the center of a comedy, is that Brian is not equipped to be a parent. He is a dog. He has his own significant character flaws, his own selfishness, his own inconsistency. The Road 2 episodes that showcase the Brian and Stewie relationship at its best are also full of moments where Brian falls short, where he prioritizes himself, where the relationship is difficult and requires both of them to work at it. Brian is not a perfect caregiver, but he is the one who shows up. And in the Griffin household, showing up is most of the battle, because Peter and Lois have largely stopped fighting it. The show's most honest statement about this arrangement is not said directly. It is built into the structure of which episodes feel most emotionally alive. The Road 2 episodes, where Brian and Stewie are together and genuinely engaging with each other, are where Family Guy most consistently produces something that feels like it has real stakes and real feeling. The episodes centered on Peter's chaotic behavior or Lois's management of the household feel increasingly hollow in the later seasons because the relationships at their center have been hollowed out. The relationship that retained its feeling, that kept producing episodes where something real seemed to be happening, was the one between the dog and the baby. Because that was the relationship in the Griffin household where someone was actually paying attention. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that reality, the reality that a dog became the most emotionally present figure in a toddler's life because the adults in the house had checked out, points directly to the larger question that the whole of this essay has been building toward. The question of what Family Guy was actually saying about parenting across its run, whether it knew what it was saying, whether the portrait it built of the Griffin household was a critique it understood itself to be making, or whether it stumbled into honesty accidentally, or whether it started with honesty and then abandoned it for something easier and more profitable. The answer to that question lives in the show's full history, from its first episode to its most recent seasons, and it is more complicated and more revealing than any single section of this essay has been able to hold on its own. Section 10. What Family Guy was saying and what it stopped saying. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy in 1995 while studying animation at the Rhode Island School of Design. He developed two short films, The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, which Fox executives saw and responded to. Fox gave him $50,000 to make a pilot. He completed it after 6 months of hand animation. The show debuted on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33, which meant its first audience was one of the largest a new television show could hope for. MacFarlane was 25 years old. The show he built at 25 had a specific idea at its center, and that idea was not simply that a dysfunctional family is funny. It was that a specific kind of American household, the working class home where love is real, but tools are absent, and damage gets passed along without anyone noticing, was worth examining. Peter Griffin was the examination. MacFarlane described Peter, in his own words, as Archie Bunker without the knowledge of what he is doing. That description is a precise creative intention. Archie Bunker, the central character of the 1970s show All in the Family, worked as satire because the show was always smarter than Archie was. The audience understood things Archie did not understand. They could see the gap between what Archie believed and what was actually true. The comedy came from that gap, and the gap had a point. It was saying something about a kind of man and a kind of household that American television had mostly treated as harmless or even admirable. All in the Family said it was neither. MacFarlane built Family Guy on the same intention. Peter was not the hero whose point of view the show endorsed. He was the subject. The show was supposed to be smarter than Peter. That was the deal. In the early seasons, the deal held. Peter's failures as a father were not simply funny. They were the show's way of pointing at something real about how certain kinds of men become certain kinds of fathers. The connection the first section of this essay drew between Frances Griffin's abuse of Peter and Peter's treatment of Meg is not something the show hid. It built it carefully, across multiple seasons, across multiple episodes, that slowly assembled the picture of a man whose damage came from somewhere specific and landed on his children in recognizable ways. That is not the work of a show that is simply trying to make you laugh. That is the work of a show that is trying to make you understand something. The specific thing Family Guy was trying to make you understand in its early years was about the gap between how the American family gets talked about and how it actually functions. The Griffin household on Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island looked, from the outside, like the standard television family. House, yard, 2 parents, 3 kids, a dog. The comfortable furniture of American domestic life. And inside that comfortable furniture, the show was placing things that did not match the furniture at all. A father who inherited abuse and passed it along. A mother who managed the household with genuine competence and consistently failed to protect her most vulnerable child. Children who absorbed the household's dysfunction in ways that shaped who they became. A family dog who ended up being the most emotionally present adult figure for the youngest child. That is a portrait. And in its early seasons, Family Guy was painting it deliberately. The comedy was the delivery system for the portrait, not a replacement for it. You could watch early Family Guy and laugh at Peter's obliviousness, and also, if you were paying a different kind of attention, see something true about what obliviousness costs the people who live with it. Both things were available. The show put them both there. The cancellation and revival changed the balance. Family Guy was canceled in 2002 after 3 seasons. It came back in 2005, driven by strong DVD sales and continued fan interest. In the years between, the writers and McFarlane had time to assess what had made the show connect with its audience. The assessment they made, reasonably enough, was that the outrageous moments, the cutaway gags, the jokes that pushed further than other shows would go, were what people remembered and what they wanted more of. That assessment was not wrong. Those things were genuinely part of why the show worked. What the revival gradually got wrong was the belief that those things were the whole of why the show worked, rather than the vehicle through which something more considered was being delivered. As the show went deeper into its revival run, the vehicle became the destination. The cutaway gags were no longer delivering the portrait, they were replacing it. The specific, careful connection between Peter's behavior and its causes, between the damage he had received and the damage he passed on, between what his children experienced and what that experience produced in them, got thinner and thinner as the seasons went on. What remained was the behavior without the understanding underneath it. And behavior without understanding is not satire, it is just behavior. McFarlane stepped back from running the writer's room as the show continued. He moved into films and other projects. The writers who took on more of the daily work pushed harder on what had worked before, which is a natural response to the pressure of keeping a long-running show going. More extreme, more shocking, more of the things the audience had already responded to. What this process gradually removed was the restraint that had made the early seasons feel purposeful. The later seasons of Family Guy are louder than the early ones. They are also, in the ways that matter most, quieter. The thing the show had to say got harder and harder to hear under the noise. The show was renewed in April 2025 for 4 additional seasons, taking it through the 2028 to 2029 television season. Family Guy will have been on the air across its original run and its revival for close to 30 years by the time those seasons complete. That is an extraordinary run for any television show. It is an especially extraordinary run for a show that began with a specific creative intention that it subsequently spent the better part of 2 decades walking away from. What makes this worth saying clearly, at the end of an essay that has tracked the parenting failures of the Griffin household across 10 sections and the show's full history, is that the early intention was good. It was genuinely good. The show McFarlane built at 25, the one that debuted after the Super Bowl in 1999, had something real to say about a kind of family that television mostly avoided examining honestly. The working-class American household, where love exists, but damage also exists, and the two things are not in competition with each other. Where a father can genuinely care about his children and still pass along the harm he inherited without understanding that he is doing it. Where a mother can be the more functional parent and still fail the child who most needs her protection. Where children absorb what the household produces and become, over time, different versions of what they might have been in a different environment. That is the show Family Guy was. And the show it eventually became, the one that throws Meg off a castle as a reference reference to Braveheart and has Peter attempt to manipulate his pregnant daughter into having an abortion, and treats all of it as broadly funny without any of the early seasons surrounding structure of consequence and reflection, is genuinely different. Not louder, not more extreme in a way that deepens the original intention, just different. The point got lost. The portrait got abandoned. What remained was the frame without the painting. The children inside that frame, Meg and Chris and Stewie, are the clearest evidence of what got lost. In the early seasons, they were being used to say something. Their experiences inside the Griffin household were the show's primary evidence for its argument about what this kind of family produces. Meg's position as the household's target was uncomfortable because the show was holding it up and asking you to look at it honestly. Chris's hidden talents were meaningful because they showed you what a child can contain that his parents never bother to find out about. Stewie's relationship with Brian was the show's most direct statement about what happens when parents check out, told through the strange and funny image of a dog becoming a toddler's most reliable companion. All of that was there. All of it was intentional, at least in the beginning. And the fact that it was there means the show cannot be simply dismissed as a crude cartoon that was always only interested in shock. It was interested in something more than that, for long enough to build a portrait that holds up to serious examination even now. The tragedy is not that the portrait was never there. The tragedy is that it was there, and the show stopped painting it. What Family Guy was saying, in its best years, was that the American family is not what the comfortable furniture of television suggests it is. That the house on Spooner Street contains things that the outside does not see. That love and damage travel together in families more often than anyone wants to admit. And that the children at the center of that travel deserve to have what is happening to them taken seriously rather than laughed away. The show said this with enough skill and consistency in its early seasons that it earned the right to be taken seriously itself. What it stopped saying, gradually and then completely, is that any of it mattered. That the damage had weight. That the children's experiences produced consequences that someone should account for. The show kept the family. It kept the house and the furniture and the voices and the jokes. It let go of the understanding that had made all of those things mean something. And that, more than any individual episode or any specific parenting failure documented across the previous 9 sections of this essay, is the real parenting problem inside Family Guy. Not just that Peter and Lois failed their children, but that the show that was supposed to be watching, the show that was supposed to be smarter than Peter, eventually stopped watching too. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.